The UFC is known for bringing the toughest men in the world together in a bid to see who is the cream of the crop. Over the years, we have seen some of the heaviest of heavy hitters in the octagon and been treated to some of the best ever to do it. But we have also seen some truly shocking fighters. Today, we are discussing the worst UFC fighters of all time. Stay with us. First up, we're talking about James Toney. Toney was a champion boxer with an impressive record of 77-10, and over the course of his boxing career took out some big names, such as Evander Holyfield and Vasily Jirov. He also held multiple world titles in 3 different divisions, so it's safe to say he knew what he was doing with his hands. However, MMA isn't just striking, which he found out during his first and only fight. Toney could have been forgiven for taking a tune-up fight, simply to get to grips with a sport he had zero experience in. But instead, he chose one of the baddest heavyweights on the planet at the time, Randy Couture. The decision to fight Randy would turn out to be a terrible one, as he was taken down without landing a single punch before tapping out. I mean, he was so inept in the octagon that he couldn't even do that properly, and simply waved his hands as Randy locked in the arm triangle choke. What did you guys make of Toney's only MMA performance? We have Kimbo Slice coming through now. Stay with us. Kimbo found fame as an internet backyard brawling sensation, but his skills in street fights simply did not translate to the octagon. He made his debut on The Ultimate Fighter heavyweight show, dropping a TKO loss to the future knockout merchant Roy Nelson. Whilst picking up a win against Houston Alexander in the finale of the show, he would go on to lose in the UFC proper to Matt Mitrione via TKO at UFC 113. Whilst certainly not the worst fighter ever to grace the UFC octagon, Kimbo's is a lesson in how street fighting usually doesn't cross over into MMA very well. Unless you happen to be Jorge Masvidal, that is. Give us your thoughts on the late Kimbo Slice below. Tony Holm is up next. Stick around. During the early days of the UFC, the company struggled to get decent heavyweights through the door, and as such, had to rely on mere journeymen to fill the ranks. And calling Holm a journeyman is no stretch whatsoever, as he only had one professional win to his name when he appeared at UFC 13 against Randy Couture. Similar to Toney, Holm had no business being in the octagon with Randy, who would finish his UFC career with 11 wins, and had dropped his last 3 fights before appearing in the UFC. And he would show his inexperience during his first and only fight by running straight at Couture and attempting a double leg takedown. Randy easily stuffed it and reversed the takedown before choking him out. Holm's life post-fighting would be interesting and tragic in equal measure, to say the least. After joining an ultra-right-wing political party in his native Finland, he would commit suicide in 2010. R.I.P. We're talking about John Hess now. Ah yes, John Hess. After watching UFC 4 and deciding he could easily beat someone like Royce Gracie, Hess decided to put his name forward for a fight at UFC 5. I mean, it was literally that easy to get an MMA fight back in the day. It was clear during his fight with Andy Anderson that he had never been involved in any sort of high-level martial arts combat in his life, as he simply resorted to flailing his arms around like a child in the schoolyard, before then eye-gouging his opponent to get out of the ass-kicking being handed out to him. The stunt resulted in him being fined $2,000, and he was also asked to never return to the UFC's octagon. Do you guys remember this guy and his antics? Joe Son is coming through now. Stay tuned. Not only is Son one of the worst fighters ever to make an appearance in the UFC, but he is also objectively one of the worst people to be gifted an opportunity in the organization. After gang raping, kidnapping, and then attempting to murder a woman on Christmas Eve 1990, he would turn out at UFC 4 in December 1994. In the UFC's defense, nobody found out about the crime until 2008, when he was sentenced to a somewhat lenient 17 years and 4 months in state prison. But he had already well embarrassed himself in the octagon by then. The fight itself was against Keith Hackney in what was actually his first ever MMA fight in any promotion. Hackney forced Sun to tap via blood choke at a time when kicks to the groin were allowed. Women everywhere need not fear Sun, however, even given the leniency of his original sentence. In 2011, he beat a fellow offender to death, bagging himself an additional 34 years to a life sentence. Jeez, what do you guys make of this unsavory fellow? Next up, it's Emmanuel Yarbrough. It's easy to look at guys from the early days of the UFC and point out their obvious flaws, given how much the sport has moved on these days, but some guys simply should never have been in the octagon whatsoever. The late Emmanuel Yarbrough, weighing more than 400 pounds, was one of them. He proved that bigger doesn't necessarily mean better during his solitary UFC performance against Keith Hackney at UFC 3, as his immobility was called into question. He barely had any combat skills whatsoever either, and mostly relied on just throwing his considerable weight around. Hackney landed a palm strike on Yarbrough, which sent the big sumo down and almost ruined the octagon. After the fight started again, Hackney again knocked the big man down, following him to the floor to land some big shots. Yarbrough was never invited back for obvious reasons. What did you guys make of Manny Yarbrough? Art Jimerson is up next. Don't go anywhere. During those early experimental days of the UFC, fighters who had no business being pitted together were regularly seen throwing down. There were all sorts of gimmicks too, including sumos against men half their size, and a man who marketed himself, bizarrely, as a one-gloved boxer. What? We hear you cry. It's true. This man was Art Jimerson, a professional boxer who would finish his career in the squared circle with a record of 33-18. Jimerson would appear in the first ever UFC tournament on November 12, 1993, going up against the legendary Royce Gracie. The Brazilian wasted no time taking Jimerson down. Without feeling a single gloved or ungloved punch, he would then demonstrate how truly out of his depth he was by tapping without Gracie even having a submission locked in. The footage of Jimerson dancing around the octagon with a solitary glove on his left hand is truly bizarre and simply shows just how wild the UFC was in those early days. Do you remember this guy? John Matua is joining us now. Sadly for Matua, his first fight in the UFC was against one Tank Abbott. However, in the build-up, he was expected to perform much better than he did, having marketed himself as a Hawaiian bone breaker. Abbott wasted no time in getting his opponent out of there, as he knocked him out in the very first round. Of course, Matua's terrible performance ensured he would never be invited back. And rightly so. Incidentally, Abbott would go on to fight twice more on the same evening, after beating Matua, proving those really were the wild, wild days. Do you guys remember this fellow? And finally, a WWE star. Phil CM Punk Brooks became a modern-day version of those early guys, as he entered the UFC with little to no formal training back in 2016. The WWE star proved just how delusional he was after assuming that his professional wrestling abilities would somehow translate into an MMA octagon. There are those who say Punk should be commended for wanting to test himself, but that is what the amateurs and the regional circuits are for, not the big leagues. Dana White Fight is lucky that Brooks didn't suffer any serious injury during his 2 fights in the promotion, as he easily could have, considering the complete lack of skill. I mean, we're not even sure how an athletic commission sanctioned either of his fights. His first appearance came against the tough Mickey Gall, who has won 6 times in the promotion, including an impressive performance against Sage Northcutt, but it didn't last long. Gall simply took Punk down and choked him in a matter of seconds, proving that you don't play MMA. His second fight was originally a unanimous decision loss against Mike Jackson, but it was overturned to a no contest after Jackson tested positive for marijuana. Ridiculously. What did you guys think of Punk's UFC career? As usual, thanks for tuning in today, and remember to stop by again next time when we will be discussing all sorts of other cool bits and pieces. And why not do us a solid by liking today's video, while also sharing it with any UFC heads you know of. Bye guys!